the fun things. So friends, welcome to Palmacia's. Sorry, I'm trying to talk to you, talk to the people in the room, and then the TV's got some warning up. So this is just, there we go. Oh, no, we don't want to. All right, there we go. So welcome to Palmacia's Summer Bible Study on 1st and 2nd Samuel, and today is July 25th, and we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 11. But before we do, Mary Beth, I wonder if you would read our opening prayer, which I will share now.
Yes. My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. The Lord raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. Amen.
Amen. So we're going to get into chapter 11 today, and this is a chapter that most of y'all are very familiar with. This is probably one of the most well-known Old Testament stories, David and Bathsheba, right? And so this is a pivotal kind of turning point in the story of David. There's been a number, right? So we talked about when he kind of solidified the kingdom. So when he was made king of Judah, I think in chapter 2, and then in chapter 5, he's made king of Israel. So in that act, he unifies something that Saul was never able to do. So there's various points that are important in the story of David. But I would lift up that this one is pivotal in a kind of different way. Obviously, there's going to be a change in the story of David. I think from what we've read up to this point, it's almost been kind of a fairy tale. He's a powerful military, a commander. He's a king that unifies an entire country. He brings the ark to Jerusalem. He kind of solidifies the religious power in Jerusalem. So all of these things are good. There's nothing really that's bad that happens. We get kind of points of temptation like the cedars that he builds his house, or the concubines that he has. And you start to see kind of issues, but there's nothing kind of traumatic. I would kind of wager that after this, it's fair to say that David is a tragic figure. There's an element of downs, of tragedy, of veering off in the wrong direction that there hasn't been up to this point. So before we read, I want to stop and ask, what are your thoughts on David up to this point? So David, as you know him through chapter, what did we read last week? 7? To chapter 7. What are your thoughts up to that point on David? It's really important for us to kind of think about these things before we move on to the next chapter, to today's chapter.
It sort of changes. First, he's sort of like the underdog, and he's gets a little power, and he gets maybe full power.
Yeah.
But it's been changing. Now it's changing again.
Yeah. So there's kind of a dynamic to the story in here.
He's been very effective so far. He's an effective politician, effective in military operations. Looks like he can't do anything wrong. If you look at it, because as Dennis said, initially he was this young kid with a slingshot.
Right.
And was able to overcome big odds there. And he's just been doing that ever since.
Yeah. So we have from Dennis that the story's changing, it's dynamic. Martin lifted up that he's been effective in all that he's done. I wonder what y'all at home think about David up to kind of chapter 7. What are your thoughts on the character of David?
Well,
Yes.
I am struck by how gifted he is. He's a musician, a poet. He was the youngest, which placed him on the lowest rung of the ladder in that culture. But God raised him above that. He was bold facing Goliath. And of course, it's really impossible to talk about this and not know the rest of the story. I understand you're trying to keep us focused here. I understand that, but you can't help but think of that such giftedness is really a mixed blessing. And I'll stop with that.
Thanks. I think that's a great point, and the text makes that evident chapter after chapter. The text is reminding us of his giftedness and how successful he is, and that he's with God and that God's with him. Any other thoughts before we dig into to today's chapter?
I think he's a very emotional person. I mean, you don't see men in the Bible that, I mean, he cried when Saul's son died.
Yeah,
I mean, he
Jonathan.
seems to be a very good-looking man that the women are attracted to.
He
The way he
danced.
danced, I mean, he seems to, like being the poet and musician, he seems to be really let his feelings emerge.
Yeah, that's a perceptive thing to say. So Debbie lifted up just how emotional he is, and I think that text does a really good job of giving us more than, like some action movie. This guy is just kind of a very masculine hero type. There's definitely levels to David, and the emotional capacities just kind of highlighted in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. Mary Beth?
I think the seeds of the future are planted in that first part, though. He seems arrogant at times. And I think that that sort of foreshadows what's going to happen.
So I wouldn't disagree with you, but I wonder if you'd point out some places that you've seen that arrogance.
When he goes up against Goliath, I don't think it's just confidence there. He seems arrogant to me.
Yeah, we had a good conversation on that last time when we were on that chapter, whether it was confidence or trust in God or both. So that's a one that comes to mind. There's a number of times when he goes out to battle that confidence rises up too, and depending on how you read it, you could read it as arrogance.
Will?
Yeah. Yes, Rob.
Yeah, as I was reading past chapter 7, I came across verse 15 in chapter 8, which really struck me. David reigned over all Israel, and David executed not just justice, but true justice among all his people. And to me, that in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Hosea, this theme that those in power are to execute true justice as instruments of God. It just struck me there. It's only one verse, but the rabbis today highlight that in their comments. Today's rabbis comment, the execution of justice is considered in the Bible to be the king's foremost duty, and David is thus pictured as the ideal king.
Yeah.
And so I recognize the military victories that David wins. I recognize his faith in Yahweh, his concern for the Ark of the Covenant. But I guess I agree with the current rabbis that, boy, David is the ideal king. Why? Because he executes true justice in the name of Yahweh. And I would agree with that. And that's a pretty central verse there.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so chapter 8 mentions that's a pivotal verse for sure. It's also an extremely bloody, violent, gory chapter. There's lots of death. There's the hamstringing of horses. I mean, it is gruesome. Chapter 8 is, and it's building into this kind of myth of who David is. But before we jump to today's, I just want to make sure: is there anyone else that wanted to add anything? So we're jumping a couple chapters. what happens in between. So we ended chapter 7, that was our discussion last week. Chapter 8 is, it's just violence. It's him going and conquering more and more people. As Rob lifted up, there is that mention of him executing justice and administering justice amid those under his charge. And then we get what might be, I think, one of the most interesting chapters of 2 Samuel, and that's chapter 9. And that's where all of a sudden he says, is there anyone else of Saul's family that I haven't taken care of? And they lift up Mephibosheth, who is Jonathan's son, who was disabled. And there's this story that his caretaker dropped him when they were trying to hide. But what we do know is that he is lame in his feet, that he has some kind of disability. And what David does is David basically gives him everything he can of Saul's land. And then he has Mephibosheth.
Somebody did it.
He has Mephibosheth eat at his table every night. And that's kind of the highest honor you could have as someone, that's one of, in the king's circle, would be to eat at his table. So there's just this, if you haven't read it, go read chapter 9, because like Betsy was lifting up, I think that's one of those chapters that humanizes David beyond the kind of military exploits. Anyhow, we go into chapter 10, and there's this story about the Ammonites. David's trying to have a good relationship with them. They think he's spying on them. They start preparing for war, and they invite the Arameans to kind of fight David with them. And of course, David destroys them. So we basically have war, and then this just heart-rending story of this son of David's best friend, Jonathan, who he takes care of. So I'm going to pull up today's reading. And we are in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. So I want to point out that this is just a very familiar story to all of us. So I want you to kind of pay attention to a couple things as we read this. Pay attention to David, obviously. Pay attention to Bathsheba, what she says, what she does, how she's referred to. And pay attention to God. Where is God in this story, and where is God not in this story? So, Sybil Hull, I wonder if you would read verses 1 through 13.
Okay.
And then Lee, I wonder if you would read 14 through 27. Is that okay?
That's great.
All right, so I'll go back up to the beginning.
In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to fetch her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, "Uriah did not go down to his house," David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house.
Will, did you ask me to read?
Yes, if you don't mind.
In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servant Uriah, at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son.
So
But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
there it is. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Sybil. So I'm going to walk through this. This text is so familiar to us, but there's some things I want to point out because this is a story that is not complex, right? There's just a kind of story that unfolds. There's some complexity as to the action that happens, but I would just say that the story is pretty straightforward what happens. What brings it its depth is all of the kind of posturing David is doing to try to kind of fix the mistake he has made. And that brings a lot of questions to mind. Why is he doing this? If he's such a ruthless-hearted king, why doesn't he just, deal with the consequences? What is it inside of him that's making him want to cover his tracks? The role of Uriah, the role of Bathsheba, and then where is God in this? So, 1st and 2nd Samuel, I personally think is one of the great narratives of the Old Testament. It's just such a well done story. And if you don't believe me, compare the stories in here to the stories in Chronicles. It's like watching something in color in 4K to watching like an old cartoon that's in black and white. I mean, it's such a big difference. But the thing to think about here in this story is we need to think about where David is in his life. He is at the height of power, and that power is both religious, military, economic. You could kind of go on. The list goes on and on as far as the power that David has accumulated. And then we have this wonderful sentence, the time when the kings go out to battle. So this is saying that there's this time essentially throughout the year and the kings are going to battle. It's just this expectation that that this is going to happen. And what happens? The kings go out to battle, but David remains at Jerusalem. That tells us just so much right there, right? The kings go out to battle. That's what's expected. And yet David remains at Jerusalem. So trouble is afoot. So this section, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this because I've heard sermons preached about, oh, Bathsheba and she's a temptress. And I've heard the exact opposite. You know, this is all David. He's power hungry. He's lustful. And so it kind of depends on how you read the text as for what's going on. I would say that David bears the brunt of the blame in this story. There are a couple points in the text that indicate that Bathsheba might have done something, but the point being is David is the one in power. David is the one that is reported to be making the action throughout this story. But it's interesting to think about what, if any, role does Bathsheba have, and what voice, power does she have against a king of Israel? So anyhow, David sees her. He is told right off the bat her name, but he's also told she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So a couple of things. She's married, right? That's a big no-no. The second is Uriah is a Hittite, so he's not from Israel, but we know he's a soldier of Israel. So most likely he's kind of a nativized citizen. He's lived there long enough and he's become kind of an Israelite by default. There's plenty of stuff in the Old Testament about that. The next thing is Uriah. What does Uriah mean? It's, I want to get this right. God is my light. So we're getting something here in the story that we don't pick up in English, and that is Uriah is a faithful person. At least his name proclaims that. So anyhow, David brings Bathsheba. They sleep together. And then in verse 5, we have the only words that Bathsheba speaks the entire story. I am pregnant. That's all she says this entire story. So with those words, their little tryst all of a sudden becomes something much, much more. And David has to figure out what to do. So he sends for Uriah, and there's this euphemism in verse 8. Go down to your house and wash your feet. We all kind of pick up on what he's saying here, right? David's trying to cover his tracks by having Uriah go sleep with his wife so that he'll think that that's his kid, and so will the community. So there's this euphemism, wash your feet. You'll see that in Ruth when it talks about Ruth going with Boaz. There's this language about the feet, and that's a common euphemism in ancient Near Eastern text and in Jewish Israelite text. So one thing I skipped over is in verse 7, this, I think, points out how deceitful David is in this story. And this is, again, we don't get this in the English. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. The word that's used in this text is shalom, right? We all know shalom, peace, right? Yeah. It means well-being or peace. So if you look, I want to show you something. So if you're ever interested in looking at Hebrew, even if you can't read it, this is a great website I use all the time. There's plenty of good apps that are better, but if you want something free, Blue Letter Bible. But I want to show you this. So I'm in 2 Samuel 11:7, and it says, when Uriah was come unto him, David demanded of him how Joab did. Do you see this? The transliteration is shalom, but it's shalom. And how the people did, shalom, and how the war prospered, shalom. So David is using this sense of peace and well-being to inquire, and it's just deceitful because he knows what he's doing. He's in his head, he's figuring out, how do I fix this problem that I've created? So anyhow, he tries to get Uriah to go with his wife, and over again, Uriah doesn't. And so we're starting to see a contrast set up between David, the deceitful, powerful king, who does bad things, and Uriah, who's just kind of a foot soldier and does whatever is expected of him, even though David, the king, is like, go home to your wife. And he's like, no, I'm not going to go home. My fellow soldiers are sleeping in tents. So anyhow, Uriah is shown over and over again to be faithful, to be loyal, and to have an allegiance to something higher than his own kind of physical needs, even if the king is pushing him. Another point is 13, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. This is very intentional in the Hebrew. It's not like they were drinking buddies. This is like David's like, here, have another, have another. I mean, he's pushing it on him. What you're seeing here is David is trying his damnedest to just get out of the situation he's created. And the text is like, it just hits you over the head with this word, and he didn't go down to his house. And David says, go down to your house. And he didn't go down to his house. I mean, it's like to a point of redundancy, but the point being, each time that word is said, it's cementing the fault of David, and it's highlighting the loyalty, the allegiance, the upstandingness of Uriah. So the text is doing a really good job to draw this differentiation. So again, David is uber deceitful, and he sends Uriah with his own death warrant in hand to Joab. So the battle happens just as David wanted it to. Uriah is killed with other men. It's like collateral damage for him. You know, it's like, I've got to get rid of this problem. If a couple people die, whatever. So Joab knows that David could be mad at all these people that die. And so he tells the messenger, hey, at the very end, tell David, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. Joab's covering his tracks. And I think the thing that's awful about this is David is drawing all these people into his web of deception, right? He's killing Uriah. He's killing this people that are in Uriah's outfit, and then he's making Joab be responsible for the death of Uriah. Because there's that language that it's like, anyone knows you shouldn't go up to the enemy's wall. There's a story in Judges where a woman throws a rock on a guy's head and kills him. So we get through all that. David finds out he's fine as far as covering his tracks. And then there's this point that I want to highlight, 26 through 27. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. Again, the text is not referring to her as Bathsheba, but the wife of Uriah, although Uriah has died. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So that all makes sense. And then it says, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So look at 25. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another, pressure attack on the city and overthrow it. So do you see this language right here? Do not let this matter trouble you. And again, it says what David had done and displeased the Lord. This is the same word in Hebrew, and what it means, just if you wanted to translate it word for word in a concrete fashion, it literally is evil in his eye. So right here it would say, do not let this matter be evil in your eye to Joab. So David's saying, you know, this is all good. David's lost any sense of moral authority, right, with this statement. There's nothing wrong with this. Don't let this be evil in your eye. And then the chapter literally ends saying, but the thing that David had done was evil in the eye of the Lord. So you're seeing something happen here we haven't seen before. And commentator after commentator says this is the turning point where David's story just kind of collapses. This is where David loses his moral authority. This is where the Lord becomes displeased with him. Now we remember that the covenant that God made with David said, I will be with you through your children and your children's children for all time, even if they disobey me. I might punish them, but I will remain with them. So God has this kind of sticky relationship with David now. And And the text is very clear that God is not happy with what is happening. So I'm going to stop there. I want to know what y'all are thinking about this story. Did anything stick out to you that hasn't stuck out before? What do you think about David? What do you think about Bathsheba? What do you think about Uriah? And what do you think about Yahweh? Because Yahweh's not in the story until the very end. There's not like, God's not working behind the scenes like we think about in David and Goliath. God is just right at the end to kind of condemn the behavior. Lee?
I'm getting more complexity from this story than I have had before. And even though it seems to be such a straightforward account, I think that, David is culpable, and also that he knows in Hebrew culture, and I don't know exactly about the time period, but I know that that in Hebrew culture, the penalty for adultery is stoning to death. And so he also knows that if the whole community sees that Bathsheba is pregnant and Uriah is out on the battlefield over a period of time, that she's going to be stoned. So to me, there's a little bit more complexity there. And the other thing that's interesting to me is that this is the time when most women would not be fertile. And so against all odds, she conceives, or they conceive. And it almost seems like a trap for David's weakness. I just wonder about, I don't know. I don't think that David was entrapped. And on the other hand, I wonder how God could let this happen. Was it to, for a lesson for us in the 21st century? I mean, why?
So that's a lot, and that's all really good points. So one of the things I want to remark on first and foremost is you said this is a time when a woman wouldn't be fertile, right? And in the ancient Near East at this time, they thought that was the most fertile time. And so in the logic of the story and of their understanding of human sexuality and how things work, they thought if you were reading the story in that time frame, you would think, oh, well, this makes lots of sense that would happen. I think the complexity you lift up is really important because often this story is told as David had an affair, and an affair is bad. But what you're lifting up is so important because I think the thing that struck me reading it this time is, why is David trying so hard to cover his tracks? He's the king, he can do whatever he wants. And I think you see there is the moral dilemma he faces because as an Israelite, he knows the law. And the law, even though he can kind of disobey it on the human plane, he still has to deal with Yahweh. And I think that's that kind of, that thorn in his side that kind of gets him. Did you go down to your house? Did you go down to your house? That's, I think, why he's doing that. Because if you think about it, another king from another country would probably just kill Uriah outright. They just kind of, do whatever they want. And so I think that complexity that's in this story is a remembrance of something I lifted up at the very beginning, that this story is a very human story. And yet God and theology are just threaded throughout it. And so you have here one of the perfect ideas of a conflict between human want and desire and action, and the kind of overarching rule of God, the sovereignty of God, and they're just clashing in this story. And David is kind of falling into the web of his own making that grows larger and larger throughout the story. Well, thanks, Lee. Martin, and then Rob.
The story deals with how many people got involved in David's subterfuge when he tried to cover it up. It was not just him. It was not Uriah, but his general, Joab, had to figure out, he got the order to have him killed. Now, how do you do that? So Joab had to figure out how to do that. So he's not going to send Uriah against the wall by himself.
Right.
Because he doesn't want to look like he's killing this guy. That's not something that he wants to do. So he has to put these other people with him. So it's a whole bunch of them are going to get killed. to meet David's requirement of him in his orders. And Joab was a loyal general, as we find out later on. He does disobey him once, but it's not just David we're dealing with, it's all these others. And the one thing that, they keep referring to Uriah as the Hittite.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, authors that the same as you, that he would probably he was a Hittite, but he was now loyal to Israel.
Yeah.
But they keep doing it, and I couldn't figure out. It's never just Uriah, it's always Uriah the Hittite.
Yeah, that's a common kind of refrain as to how people would be referred to, whether it's son of someone or if they're outside of Israel, where they're from.
Yeah, I just didn't follow that. Wow. Usually when you refer to someone with a special name, that it means something, but I guess it does. That's just the way they did it.
I think there's a number of things that are playing with that. Uriah, God is my light,
Yeah.
and being a Hittite, I think in the context of just what's happening literarily, it's really making a point that Uriah, this foot soldier or whatever rank he would be, is loyal, is following the rules, and David, this king, this anointed one of God, isn't. Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, when I finished reading chapter 11, the message to me was power corrupts.
Mm.
And of course, the prophets warned against that when Israel wanted a king. And the prophet said, this is what a king will do.
Yeah.
And the question is, if power corrupts, and in the world, people of power will tend to do things like David just did. The question is, are there any consequences to the corruption of power? And that's where chapter 12 comes in, where, from the point of view of the biblical writers, the difference between Israel and the other countries is that there will be consequences when people are corrupted by power.
Right.
They just can't act with impunity. And so I see the two connected, that now David's going to find out when Nathan comes, I have to pay a consequence. Bathsheba has to pay a consequence. The baby has to pay a consequence. And so that, to me, that's the difference between, say, the pagan powerful rulers, and now that we have Israel having powerful rulers who can do stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's my view of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that's something we need to consider. And I think we kind of touched upon this, but the thought of David is king in the context of what we read in, I think it's chapter 7 or chapter 8 of the first book of Samuel, where Samuel the prophet says, when the people come, Rob just mentioned this, a king is just going to take. And here you have the most personal example of that. This isn't him just kind of taking some sheep from here or some money from here. This is him taking another man's spouse and then killing that man. And so it's the most personal take you can kind of imagine. Samuel didn't mention this was going to happen, but this is kind of like the most heightened example of that. And
Moses.
right, but it's happening in the context of these are people that have a covenant with Yahweh, and that covenant means that there's justice, and justice implies that there is right and wrong will be punished in some format. What anyone at home have any thoughts, questions, reflections on this text or on the characters within it? So I see Craig, and then Julia or Brian, and then Pam. So Craig, go ahead.
Okay, I thought the same thing about David. As we pointed out earlier in this discussion, David was extremely gifted. He was almost saint-like in the way he believed in God and followed God, and he had been so successful all the way through until this point when the power of a human desire or whatever ended up corrupting him. His human nature came through, right in this one act, he violated about 3 of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not murder or commit adultery or covet thy neighbor's wife. So he did it all in one time.
Batting average, for 1 for 3.
Craig's keeping score over here.
Yeah, well, he had a lot of problems, obviously, later on too. So,
Yeah.
but it just is. It just shows that humans are always capable of sinning and ignoring God's wishes.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, that's a good point to point out. Just in this one story alone, how many commandments are broken. And then you can think about all the other kind of laws that are associated with it outside of just the 10 Commandments. Brian or Julie, were one of y'all going to speak?
Yeah, I think we both had a little something to say. What I was going to say is a couple things. Number one, I mean, one thing I've learned from this is to never underestimate the power of Satan, right? David was at probably one of the most vulnerable positions that a man can be in, at the pinnacle of his success. And so he was vulnerable, and especially a Christian man. I mean, Satan loves to take down a Christian man. And
well, let's stop there because David is not Christian.
Well, a godly man, should I say.
Okay.
And a lesson for us going forward. So he was very vulnerable at that time, and we had seen some hints just prior to this that the spoils of success were starting to affect him. The other thing is, where was God in this? God could have intervened at any time in this, and I do think that there's a time when God steps back, lets us do what we're going to do, and bear the consequences of that. But in the end, in this grand scheme, I think there is part of that. I think he wanted the vulnerability of David to be known to all of us, because up to this point, David, I mean, everything was going right for him. And there's a chance that the Jewish people and even us later on, future generations, could think, my gosh, this guy is like God, and start to worship even David. And I think showing his human capacity to sin and his vulnerability was very important for us for many generations to come.
Thanks, Brian. Julie?
If I can dovetail off of that and what Craig said, the part of the story that has always caught my eye, I guess, is the very beginning. What was David doing lying on a couch late in the afternoon? He's supposed to be on the battlefield. And is this just a customary behavior in the kingdom? I don't know, but there's a part of it that makes me think he got a little bit lazy. He got a little bit careless. He didn't stay vigilant with his calling, with his responsibilities, with his duties and faith. And, I don't know if he was just having a nap or recovering from whining and dining. We don't really know, but it's clear that he was still, on his couch in late afternoon. And what a great reminder to be careful about getting lazy with your responsibilities, because any moment there's weakness or we lose our focus or lose our way, my goodness, life gets really complicated and bad choices happen. And David's story is a great example of that. I don't know why he was on that couch late in the afternoon, but it kind of started there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I actually was reading one commentator that mentioned that this idea of sleeping on a couch in the mid-afternoon, like Julie's lifting up, that was a common trope for someone that is lazy or is not fulfilling their obligations. And so not only do you have David not going out to war, but you have him sleeping on his couch. So we're getting to the point where David's behavior is not fitting of a king and has kind of become opulent. And that's a great point to point out, Julie. I think Pam was going to say something too.
I was just going to say, I like what everybody said, and especially what Lee said, that we see it today. We see the power of corruption. We see the human condition. And when we first studied this, a couple of weeks ago, we said that the women really have no role. And line 5 says he delivered.
Hey, Pam, I can barely hear you.
Okay, let me just, let me get really high on this. Okay,
Sorry.
I just was concerned with line 5 in the text we read. Did you hear that? Because
Verse 5?
yeah, she's conceived, and then the next line is, and that's her first dialogue to David, I'm pregnant, after she's conceived. So to me, it just shows that women really had such low, and when we talked about the story before, how she was just expected to be raped. You know, that was just the role of women because they had nothing. And I think the idea of people saying power corrupts and that we're all have weaknesses that we try and work through are important points. And I just saw a character foil. I'm an English teacher, so to me it was very much like Shakespeare. There was tragic fall, there was hubris, there was character, the good husband, and then David with the moral kind of unraveling. And I thought you covered it well.
Yeah, thank you. This is such a, I'm convinced more and more as I read through scripture how just beautiful 1st and 2nd Samuel are. Obviously, it's a religious and a scripture, but also just the storytelling element of it and how much it captures it. But yes, there's no doubt about it that women at this time were treated as property and they had no sense of rights. And you can see this over and over again. Bathsheba is referred to as either her or the wife of Uriah. And there's no sense of her kind of having any action or agency in this story. It's always David, David, David doing all of the action here. And so I think that there's people that have tried to make a point that Bathsheba bears some responsibility, but I just try to think about the power dynamics in this story, the way that the story says David did this, David did this, David did this, and I just think that's a really hard argument to make. Yeah, I think it's people just trying to cover for David.
Yeah, we're helping the guy out.
I want to show y'all, I'm going to share my screen again. I want to show you how Chronicles covers this. So if you've never read Chronicles, it's
Yeah, it's
people that read through the scripture say, yeah, just read through the Old Testament and glaze over Chronicles and get past it, because Chronicles is kind of repeating what happens in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. It's not the most enthralling book, but this is our story that we just read today in 3 verses. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army, ravaged the country of the Ammonites, and came and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Joab attacked Rabbah and overthrew it. David took the crown of Milcom from his head. He found that it weighed a talent of gold, and it was precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. He also brought out the booty of the city, a very great amount. He brought out the people who were in it, and set them to work with saws and irons and picks and axes. Thus David did to all the city of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. That's literally the exact same time period, same story, and we have none of the juicy kind of details that we get in 1st and 2nd Samuel. But you'll also notice it doesn't want to show David as a flawed character at all. And so that's a great example of, even in scripture itself, there's varying accounts and the stories are being told in different ways. And you can see this kind of narrative impulse in Chronicles to say, well, David's a great guy. He beat this guy and stole his crown and put it on his head. But we have 1st and 2nd Samuel revealing warts and all portrait of David. And I wanted to ask y'all, and this kind of goes back to Lee and Brian's point, is why is this in the Bible, and what role, if any, does God have in this story? Is this kind of a lesson for us as readers? Why is it included here and not included in Chronicles? And what role is God playing in it? Because I think that's a really important thing for us to consider. This is a very human story. There's no mention of motivations beyond just the physical impulses of David's power and lust, and then he's got to cover his tracks. And yet it displeases God or is evil in his eyes. Betsy.
Who wrote First and Second Samuel?
We don't know.
Okay.
So there's
It's not just precedent for David.
there's a kind of legend that went around and it was said Samuel wrote it, but Samuel dies halfway through, so Samuel didn't write.
It's hard to write when you're dead.
Yeah, but most likely what happened was these stories were told orally for hundreds of years, and we know it was written down that the earliest examples of it are around the time of Babylonian exile. And if you remember, that is the time when the Jewish people are starting to write down everything, because Jerusalem has not only been sacked, but it's been completely destroyed. And so all of a sudden there's this kind of survival mode that we need to kind of write down everything and not just have it in our heads. So they're writing it down, but they're also, at that same time, they're trying to make sense of, why did this happen to us? Why did this happen to God's people? And so they're looking back on their stories of the past to explain their present. So it's written around there. We don't know who exactly wrote it. We've got a couple minutes. What thoughts do y'all have on God's role, if any, and why do we have this story? Why is this story told?
I think that David does come around in ways. He's very sorry later on for the things. I think it gives people hope to know that we do make mistakes. We didn't hear anything about God. I personally think David was so caught up in all his riches and power that he forgot about his God.
Yeah.
He wasn't loyal to God. I don't think he was communicating or praying or asking God for guidance, or he wouldn't have done what he did. But I think as people, we did the same thing. And then when we're hurting, I think it shows hope and that God is always there for us. One thing that struck me that I never had heard before was Uriah was carrying his own death warrant.
Yeah.
And that just gave me more of like, how could David give him the letter that said, Boaz or Joab, have this man killed? I kind of lost a little of my respect for David.
Yeah.
But then again, we're all human. We all make mistakes. So.
That's a biggie, though.
Yeah.
It's a biggie. It's a very biggie.
He was glorious, but he had a lot of faults.
Yeah. Thank you. Mary Beth?
You asked me to write a Lenten reflection about Psalm 51.
Yep, I remember it.
And in that psalm, David repents and he's miserable about what he has done. And, it made me think, how can he be both a man after God's own heart and a murderer, an adulterer? How can he be both? And I think it just highlights for us the fact that even though we are sinners, we are still God's children. We are still loved and we can be forgiven. And I think David's realization of what he has done feels very familiar to me. When I have done things that have affected other people and I realize what I've done, it's a terrible feeling. And I think Psalm 51 sums that up.
Thanks, Mary Beth, and thanks for bringing up Psalm 51. I also, next week, we'll read chapter 12, which is a continuation of this story. And we begin to see penance happening on David's part, and it registering in his head just how great the depths of his deception and his adultery and his murder are. I don't think there's an answer to why this happens, why this is included. I think we have what we're doing today. And I think that's what's important, is we are wrestling as a body of believers with this story, and we're thinking about it not just as something that we read piously, but something that we read and think about the details of and relate to our own lives and think about how we can be better people, how we can avoid pitfalls, but also to think about the humanity of others that have done bad things, right? Forgiveness is in the Bible. Grace is in the Bible. I mean, that's the message of the cross ultimately. But it's wrestling with what is justice, what is right, what is wrong. And so what we're doing right now is the work. And I think instead of coming to a clear conclusion, that's what faith looks like, is interpreting the text and letting the text affect us. And through that, the Holy Spirit. I'm really excited to continue this story next week because it has not ended. I'm going to open up our benediction. I feel like there was something I was going to say. I can't remember. I was going to tell you something so profound, but we'll have to wait for next week.
Racer in first place.
Yeah. All right, let's close with the benediction together. And now, sisters and brothers, go from this place knowing that the God who made you also sustains you. The God who calls you also goes with you. May the Father be with you and speak through you. May Christ Jesus be one with you and raise you to life. And may the Holy Spirit dwell within you and make you holy. Amen. Those are some good words to end on. Thank you all so much. We'll be reading chapter 12 of 2 Samuel for next week. Have a good week. Bye.
Thank you, Will.